Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I would like to welcome you to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where myself and Dave Lefort, Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week, unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week each month. We look at the top compliance stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. In this episode, we take a look at articles from Compliance Week in March 2022 around the Russian invasion and the response, the sanctions levied by the Biden administration, EU and UK, as well as take a look at previews of the article on FedEx's ESG program in the April edition of Compliance Week. Sports, Compliance 2022, and more. I know you'll enjoy this podcast. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week. Look at stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm Tom Fox, your co-host.
And I'm Dave Lefort, Managing Director at Compliance Week. As usual, Tom, I'm thrilled to join you today to take a look at some of the things that Compliance Week is following. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look back on our coverage of Russian sanctions and their impact on compliance. We'll preview an ESG package we're publishing in April. And as always, we'll talk some sports.
Well, great, Dave. So, and you talked about probably the top topic in compliance in the broader business world right now, which is the sanctions that have been laying down because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What articles did you want to highlight?
So it's really not any one article in particular, but rather more of a theme, because I would say that we have, as you know, these sanctions have changed and have escalated as this invasion has escalated. So as have the challenges facing folks in compliance. And it's really a matter of how do you keep up. So a lot of our coverage have been around, some strategies to implement and some best practices to follow in terms of making sure that you're doing business with the right, or rather, you're not doing business with the wrong people or the wrong organization. So it's, I think, the sanctions that Russia is facing now are of the scale and scope that is really unlike anything that we've ever seen imposed on a major economy. And not only that, but you're seeing companies evaluating their business decisions regarding Russia, not just from a sanctions standpoint, but also based on their values. So you're seeing a lot of corporations pull out of Russia entirely, not just because of the sanctions regime, but because they don't want to be associated with Russia. So this is sort of a moment for corporate social responsibility and just for business as a whole. And you've seen. I'll point out one in particular, like Papa John's, for example, has decided they decided not to pull out of Russia, and they're getting a lot of heat for it. So you're seeing public pressure coming on companies that are, you could argue they're putting the bottom line before their values. But getting back to the sanctions bit, it's with the escalations of sanctions has come the escalation of risk and of the importance of due diligence for companies that have any links to Russia. And in that case, any links to Belarus as well. So this includes sanctioned persons, sanctioned companies, and that gets back down to knowing beneficial ownership of your third parties, your vendors, your customers, your suppliers, and that's a challenge in in anywhere in the world, really. But now with the escalation of sanctions in Russia, it's more important than ever to make sure that you are not doing business with the wrong people. So we put together sort of a list of best practices of on how to do your very best to ensure that you are not doing business with any sanctioned entities. So it includes, creating a risk map that includes touch points linked to Russia, to Belarus, and to some degree Ukraine as well, because you most likely if you're doing business in Ukraine or have a third party in Ukraine, that business has been interrupted to a large degree. So I don't think there's much risk in saying that. So it's mapping out your customers, your third parties, in geographically to put obviously you want to put a special spotlight on those that are in those areas in particular. So, and go along with that is undertake the appropriate due diligence. So conduct sanction screenings. Make sure you keep an eye on the FinCEN website, for example. They're issuing alerts, basically quite frequently. I was going to say nonstop, but it's not quite that, but quite frequently on alerts and red flags on companies and individuals to steer clear of when doing business because of this increase in sanctions. And you're seeing increasingly that the Western world or the industrialized world is sort of freezing out Russia to a large degree, and that's been the whole strategy behind how to sort of put pressure on Russia without, if you're NATO, without lending troops to the cause, which obviously that would, as President Biden so eloquently said, that essentially what you're talking about, if you send troops overseas or if you enforce a no-fly zone, that's essentially starting World War III. So the answer has been these sanctions, and so that has had a tremendous impact on businesses. So back to some of these best practices is you have to make sure, it's more important than ever, you need to train your relevant employees, train your relevant business partners where they can find the latest sanctions developments, what warning signs to look for. So, accounts payable, for example, accounts receivable, procurement, sales staff, obviously risk management staff, all need to be aware of what restrictions are in place and how to raise the red flags to the compliance and legal. So you really have to stay disciplined within your organization to stay on top of this, because it's difficult to keep up with it because they have been escalating at such a high rate. And then if you're doing an internal review and any sanctions violations are uncovered, it's a matter of, say you uncover a sanctions violation and let's say it is unintentional. So right then and there you have to stop doing business with that person or that entity, and depending on which sanctions were violated, there might be a duty to disclose to a regulator. So make sure you know what your requirements are, essentially. So we've published several stories in the last couple weeks or so that deal with those types of best practices. But in a large sense, it's just from a corporate social responsibility standpoint, it's been refreshing to see how many companies have sort of stepped up and taken themselves out of Russia and made a decision based on their values and not on the bottom line. But between the I guess the global freeze out of Russia and this heavy sanctions regime, it's very, very difficult for companies that are trying to do business in the right way to actually stay walking that line. Even if you have the best intentions, there is still the onus to make sure that you're doing the right thing.
So, Dave, let me pick up on one of the points you mentioned, which was in addition to corporations choosing values, the public pressure. And it's been suggested that the sustainability or social prong in ESG has actually played a part in companies pulling out of Russia, or at least stakeholders putting pressure on those companies. Is that something, and that seems to me to be a theme that you've touched on several of our episodes. You're seeing more and more this ESG component coming into play. Is that something you specifically identified in some of the Compliance Week reporting in March?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we've been following very closely. Which companies have made those decisions to pull out, which companies notably have not, and what kind of public pressure those companies have faced. So I think we're in an age now, and I don't think there's really any arguing this at this point, where the public in general is more attuned than ever to holding businesses accountable for their actions, because every business now has a core purpose. They'll have a mission statement. They'll have a statement of values, and more than ever, the public at large and shareholders and really stakeholders too. So we're talking about employees, we're talking about shareholders, we're talking about the communities that they serve, the communities that they do business in, are holding these companies accountable for these things. And if they're not making the decisions on their own, making a values-based decision, then the pressure is coming from the public for them to make that decision for them. So I think that's a really, it's been really encouraging to see this sort of, I want to call it a system of checks and balances, so that if the company's not doing the right thing for the right reasons, maybe they'll do it because there's a little bit of public pressure behind it, and because their stock price is being impacted by it. So that's been really encouraging to see, and we've followed that aspect of the story very closely.
Dave, you mentioned in your opening remarks, you might give us a teaser perhaps on some of the things that you're looking at putting out in April. You mentioned ESG. What do you have for us?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So first off is, first and foremost, we're all anxiously awaiting the SEC's public meeting on Monday to talk about their the SEC's proposal on what kind of a framework are we going to be looking at disclosing ESG-related risks. So this is something that Chairman Gensler has been hot on since he took the position. It's something that we know that the SEC has been working on. They've told us they've been working on it. We know generally that Chairman Gensler favors a disclosure regime that is consistent, and it's not one that sort of allows companies more wiggle room on what to disclose and how to disclose it. So that will be interesting to see play out. At the same time, Compliance Week, we're working on a case study looking at one particular company's ESG journey over the last 5 years. So we're taking a look at FedEx. So FedEx has notably indicated that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2040. So for FedEx, that is quite FedEx being a shipping and logistics operations with thousands and thousands of vehicles around the world and planes so FedEx has made climate change and their impact on climate change a centerpiece of what they're doing in terms of their ESG efforts. So they more than many companies are being pretty transparent about their efforts, and they're being transparent with Compliance Week about how how they developed their ESG program. Like, for example, how they came up with the year 2040. So you hear a lot about greenwashing and about companies making decisions in a vacuum to say, we pledge to be carbon neutral by whatever year. And a lot of times it's maybe a CEO and maybe a chief communications officer or PR executive that is driving those statements. And it's to obviously to show the public that, hey, we care about the environment. We're going to do our best here. But when you put it in writing like that, when you make a pledge like that, you need to have the expectation that you're going to be held accountable to that. So a lot of times, and this is becoming less and less the case now, a lot of times companies are making those statements without thinking about, okay, do we have a realistic plan on getting there? It's one thing to put a plan on paper that, pledges that we're going to cut emissions by, 5% each year up until 24, whatever it is. It's one thing to put that on paper, but when it gets time for budget planning season, and you realize that 5% cut in emissions is going to what that's going to cost on paper, then there becomes a different set of decision makers that are making those decisions. So when you don't have that alignment of your outside PR messaging with your internal decision making, then you get into trouble. Where FedEx has done it right is they've centralized it, and they've made ESG and in particular climate change one of their core tenets, and they baked it into all of their decision making. So we're engaging with their chief compliance officer, their chief sustainability officer, and we're conducting, one of our reporters, Aaron Nicodemus, has conducted several interviews with them, and we're going to have I think it's a 5-part series on exactly how FedEx is doing this, how their process started back, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago when they first came out with 2016, so 6 years ago, their first sustainability report, and where they're at today. So it's sort of taking us along on their ESG journey. So we have that case study coming out in early April. That's going to be something to watch and something that other practitioners at other companies are going to be able to learn from. We also have a module learning that will be available for all Compliance Week members on, I won't call it an ESG primer, but it's a look at how do you define ESG if you're working in compliance and you need to, and you're part of a decision-making process that involves any kind of climate disclosures or corporate social responsibility initiatives or anything related to corporate governance. So it's sort of a primer on, these are the main things you need to know. These are the guidelines, the best practices guidelines you need to follow. And pretty soon we'll have to update that with what the SEC mandates after an expected comment period on that. And so it'll be a bit before those are sort of finalized. But until then, there is that ESG is not a topic that's going away anytime soon, and we're all over it with reporting on the SEC meeting on Monday, the FedEx case study launching in early April, and shortly after we'll have a ESG training module. So CW members will have all of those to look forward to.
Well, Dave, it is, and we're recording this in late March, and I think that there's lots of momentum and enthusiasm building up for Compliance Week 2022. I saw an article this week about the top 10 reasons that you should attend Compliance Week 2022, but I wanted to maybe ask you, what are some of the top reasons that either you think people should attend Compliance Week 2022, or perhaps conversely, what are 2 or 3 of the top things that you're really looking forward to?
Yeah, so I'll say this, we are super excited about being back in person for the first time in 3 years. It's been a long time, and we are so looking forward to it. seen a ton of excitement around people wanting to get back together again for the networking piece. That's the thing that I myself am most looking forward to. Seeing people that I've talked to on Zooms and corresponded on dozens of emails with that I haven't seen face to face in 3 years. That people that I normally see at this annual event that I'll get to see and interact with and have a couple beers with again. So I'm really looking forward to the networking aspect and just sort of just being back together with people in that type of a setting again. So I'm looking forward to that. I know that a lot of other people are looking forward to that. And then, that's to say nothing of the content. I think we've programmed a pretty great agenda this year. So I think I've mentioned before, we will have two SEC commissioners, Alison Heron-Lee and Hester Pierce, that will be speaking as part of our Tuesday morning keynote. So that the event starts May 16th, runs through the 18th. So day 2. So May 17th will be when we'll have Commissioners Lee and Pierce talking together on stage. And as you know, they both have contrasting viewpoints on a lot of issues. So that's going to be fun to watch them go back and forth in that type of environment. And it might also be one of these last public speaking opportunities as a commissioner, because she's going to be leaving the SEC, I think, in June. So that might be one of the final opportunities that she'll be speaking in public as a commissioner. We have a special Women in Compliance brunch that takes place Monday morning. We have what we're calling a compliance think tank session where we're handpicking about a dozen senior level compliance executives from important or significant companies from around the world that are getting together in a room for 3 hours to talk about some big picture topics, like the evolving role of the compliance practitioner. So with more and more being thrown compliance's way or putting on compliance's plate, is it a positive? Is it a negative? Is there not enough attention being paid to supporting the compliance practitioner? Are we truly seeing an evolution of the role in general, or is this, or are we seeing more compliance support functions being created? So there's going to be a really good discussion around that. Compliance Week is going to be in the room with those folks, and we'll be writing up a comprehensive takeaways from their conversation. So we're super excited about that. Obviously, we'll be talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the business world as it relates to sanctions and corporate social responsibility. We're talking about May, which is still, I think it's 8 weeks away. So we'll see where things are at that point. But in any case, it'll still very much be top of mind for a lot of folks. We'll have various sessions related to ESG. We have someone that is going to be speaking with us virtually from Hong Kong about the impact of human slavery. We'll have the John Carreyrou, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who broke the Theranos story wide open and was the author of Bad Blood. Elizabeth Holmes had her trial. She had her trial. She was found guilty. She has yet to face sentencing. So one of the things that I'm interested in hearing from John Carreyrou about is what does he expect from the sentencing, and what kind of message is it going to send? Because for a lot of practitioners, this Theranos example is the Enron of this generation, I would say. And so the punishment of Holmes we'll see, at least in part, just how much teeth the when the DOJ says, for example, that we are looking to come down hard on individuals in particular that are convicted of things like fraud, for example, like Elizabeth Holmes was. We'll see if there's any teeth to that statement. So I think, and I want to see what John's perspective is on that. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So it's really, and then, the one thing I didn't mention is our opening keynote is going to be a woman named Karen Kenny, who she helped to co-found, I think it's the Johnson & Johnson Leadership Institute. And she co-authored a book about leading with character. So it's about how to lead ethically in an ever-changing environment. And that's really the theme of the conference in general. If there's one through line that will be common throughout, it's ethical leadership in an ever-changing environment. And that's really what Karen Kenny is going to put a spotlight on. And I've heard her speak in the past, and she's really good at putting things in perspective. I'll say that. It's about putting your own life in perspective, your own role in perspective, and how to ensure that you're always making the right decisions for the right reasons, and you're sticking with your values. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of other reasons to attend, but those are the things that I am in particular looking forward to.
So, Dave, now let's turn to some sports issues. And the thing I wanted to start with is, hopefully our audience knows you're a recovering sports journalist, and you've been a sports journalist in the city of Boston. And Boston's had some great sports writers that have both been sports writers in Boston and then gone out to the wider U.S. Sports media as well. And one of those is Jackie McMullan. And so I wanted to ask you if you could maybe reflect a little bit about what Jackie meant to perhaps the Boston sports scene. And then as she moved into ESPN and some other broader national roles, what she meant. She was certainly one of the first female sports journalists. And my reason is she's starting a podcast. And so it's her first podcast, but I really wanted to maybe ask you to give us your thoughts on Jackie McMullan.
There's nobody I respect more in this business than Jackie. And I had the privilege of working with her, both with the Boston Globe and later at ESPN. And she is truly the most talented, unique journalist that I have ever worked with. And I say that, for a number of reasons, but it's primarily because and I'll give you a few examples here, but the way that she interacts with athletes is a way, like in this day and age, it's hard, it's difficult if you are a journalist covering a team to truly get close to an athlete, because you have a very limited amount of time in the locker room. Sometimes they're now meeting with the media over Zoom. It's hard to get athletes or coaches one-on-one on the side. But I'll say this about Jackie, is that she is not only persistent, but she brought a very a human element to it. Because when you see her, I've seen her interact with athletes in a locker room, and she's not walking up to Jason Tatum, for example, and saying, so you went 14 of 20 from the floor tonight. What was going right for you? Like, she wasn't asking those questions. She was like, Jason, how is your family doing? How have you been adjusting to life in the NBA? Like she would humanize people or athletes in a way that I've never seen from anybody else. And as a result of that, these athletes they trusted her. Everybody likes Jackie. Everybody trusts Jackie. And so and as a result of that, Jackie's conversations when they actually get down to the I won't say the X's and O's because that's not really Jackie's specialty. She likes to get at the human part of the athletes. When athletes have an interview with Jackie, I find that they're willing to tell her things that they're not willing to tell anybody else. Like you could be like just take me for example. I was an editor, but I was a sometimes reporter, and I was not a great reporter. I'll be honest about that. That's fine. I can live with that. So my interview with Jason Tatum would be very much the canned, tell me about how it felt out there tonight or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that when Jackie talks to an athlete, she's able to pull out of that athlete a lot more. Their athletes open up to Jackie in ways that they don't open up to any other person in the sports media business. And that's why I think it's great that she has a podcast. This should have happened 10 years ago, honestly. Jackie is the perfect person to have a podcast because if she's sitting down with anybody, it could be, doesn't have to be a Michael Jordan or a Charles Barkley or whoever. It could be anybody. She could pull out interesting stories and authentic reactions from anybody because everybody is comfortable around Jackie. It's just how she carries herself. And, I'm going to quote, I don't know who said this, but I saw it when she retired from ESPN a few years ago. And yes, Jackie was a trailblazer. She was the first female to win the Kurt Gowdy Award, which is a media award in the Basketball Hall of Fame. And she's absolutely a trailblazer for female sports journalists everywhere. But I find that this quote here from I think it was one of her bosses at ESPN is telling because the quote is, Jackie is a trailblazer. Oh, just as I'm saying this, sorry, my computer froze. So Jackie's a trailblazer, not because she was one of the first women covering sports or the NBA. Rather, she's a trailblazer because people talked about her without mentioning sex or gender. So she transcended that, and she still does. So I'm super excited about listening to her podcast. I still keep in touch with her from time to time, but she is very much. That's the other thing about Jackie is that she would take sometimes years at a time off to just for family time. And that was something she sort of set a really great example for some of her peers in the business that, hey, you know what, you can do this. If you want to be a parent and take a few years away, if you can afford to do that, then it's okay to do that. And you can come back and you can still be great. So Jackie was the personification of that. And I think if you asked 50 people in sports journalism today who they most admire, I think you'd get a fairly substantial percentage of them would say Jackie Mack.
Wow. So I'm going to put a link to her new podcast in the show notes. I'm like you. I can't wait for it. It's years overdue. I guess, Dave, the thing that struck me in the interviews I've heard with her are a couple of things, and you touched on them both. One is she continually gives advice for younger reporters on the craft of journalism. Yeah. She talks about what you have to do, how you have to do it, and how to do it even in the world of today, as you said, which may be a Zoom call as opposed to being in the locker room like her generation was able to. The second thing is you also touched on was the family aspect. She played basketball in college, and so she's had a love of sports for a long time, but I think her daughters played as well. And she would share about doing exactly what you said, taking some time off and spending time with their daughters and kids and being a mother and in the middle of being one of literally the top sports journalists in America. So she personalized sports in a way that few writers can. And she's just a great treasure and asset, really, I think, in the United States.
And you know what? What you said reminded me. I've seen her on multiple occasions in locker rooms. You might see sometimes the athletes, they'll if they're angry or whatever, they might shout down a reporter or just treat a reporter disrespectfully. So when Jackie saw that happen, she would not make a public display, but she would make it a point to go to that athlete after the fact and say, you know what, you didn't treat that reporter back there very, very nicely. You didn't treat them very respectfully. So I just want to let you know that I saw that. And so she sort of like policed the athletes, and she stood up for reporters everywhere. And you're right. It was primarily the younger generation of reporters and people with not that much experience. And so she was a mentor to many of them.
Next up, Dave, we've got some great basketball happening, both on the college level and on the NBA, as we've got, I think, 3 weeks left in the NBA season. I wanted to maybe ask you about your Celtics, because I think we had this conversation in December and you were not very high on them, but they've really seemed to have turned it around. I can't say they'll make the finals this year, but they can certainly be competitive in the East in the playoffs. How are you feeling?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Like if you go back even, I don't know, a month and a half ago, they were a 500 team. They would win 2, they would lose 2. It was and they had been a 500 team for, at that point, about 18 months. So it was getting a little bit frustrating, but they put it together. I don't know if it was their new coach Udoka that finally started listening more to him, or if it's Marcus Smart, their point guard, being sort of buying into a playing less selfish basketball, or the development of a couple of young players. But it's all clicking right now. So I just, right before this podcast, I looked at the numbers. So they're an NBA best 17-3 in the last 20 games, and they're still. They started at 500. They were 500 for a long time, but now they're the hottest team in basketball. They are the number 4 seed in the East. I'm guessing they're going to eventually pass the Sixers to get to the number 3 seed. They could even get as high as number 2. And this 17-3 record is not. It's not a bunch of chumps that they're beating. Like this includes a win over the Warriors just the other night. They've beaten the Nets twice. They've beaten the Sixers, but I think they've lost to the Pistons, but that's more an outlier. But all of that said, at the end of the day, if you ask me, is this a team that can contend for the NBA title? And I would still say no, unfortunately. I think they're a piece or two away. I don't think they're better than the Bucks. I don't think they're better than the Heat. So it's encouraging, and they're still young, and they're still, Jason Tatum still hasn't hit his peak yet. I don't think Jaylen Brown has hit his peak yet. So I still think that there's still a ton of growth there to be had. So this is not the end, but I don't think that this is a title contending team. Would you make an argument otherwise?
I'm not sure they're a title contending team, but I do think they can play a big role in the Eastern playoffs. And I think they can knock off, maybe with the exception of perhaps the Bucks. I think they can be competitive with anyone. And, as we both know, once you get in that 7-game series, literally anything can happen. So if you can put yourself in that position, and somebody goes down with an injury or something on the opposing team, you can position yourself to take it up to the next level. But I guess the turnaround is what has impressed me the most. And this kind of streak they're on, you can go into, if they can sustain this streak and go into the playoffs this hot, I sure would want to face them in the first 2 rounds.
Oh yeah. So I would say I would pencil them in to definitely get through the first round. And if they get past the second round, I consider that gravy after that. So I would love to see that happen. So you're looking at potentially a second round matchup with a team like the Sixers, or a team perhaps the Bucks, and that's where, like you said, I think there's trouble. I don't think they have an answer for Giannis. But you're right. You never know. You get an injury here or there. You get a couple of breaks, but I don't think this is a title contending team, unfortunately. However, it is going to be fun. They're a team that's fun to watch right now because they play a fun brand of basketball, and there was a lot of infighting earlier this year, and it was just sloppy. They were so inconsistent night in, night out. But now they're playing confidently. They're a fun team to watch. You actually enjoy looking on the schedule, saying, "Oh, look, there's a Celtics game tonight. Maybe I'll watch the second half." Whereas earlier this year it was like, "Oh, Celtics are on. All right, well, maybe I'll watch Netflix." So, but yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the playoffs because I think they got a chance to, like I said, anything past the second round, I think, is gravy. I don't think they get to the finals, but I would love to be proven wrong.
And for our final topic, maybe we could say a few words on something that really surprised me, which was the owners in Major League Baseball and the Players Association were able to work out their differences enough that we're going to have an abbreviated spring training and then some real baseball. Did that surprise you, or did you think when you put billionaires together with millionaires, somebody would wake up and say, let's work this out?
So it surprised me too. I'll be honest. I thought this was going to be a truncated season. I thought that it was going to take the cancellation of a certain number of games to get the players eventually to. I thought the players were going to be the ones that were going to blink first in this case. So I mean, I'm certainly very glad that there's going to be a full season. However, was this necessary? I think personally that if both sides were honest with themselves 3 months ago and said, okay, let's play this out. What is the most likely scenario? Like what both sides give a little bit, right? As in any negotiation, they could have worked. The deal that they came back with is not dissimilar from where they started, I would say. Meaningfully. So why I mention that is because over that time period, I think you and I were very much speaking for most baseball fans in the sense that there was a great deal of disgust and a lack of confidence that these sides could work out a deal. They ended up coming to their senses and they had a deal, but I guess my frustration is that they could have come up with this same deal 3 months ago, and we could have avoided this, and we could have got a real MLB offseason, which is always fun. We could have had a real spring training, and we're going to get a full season, and I'm looking forward to that. But I don't know. I just still have a lot of disgust, and baseball is slowly losing me, I think.
I was stunned. I heard the statistics on a podcast earlier this week, and there is an audience of 81 million people who watch esports on television. That's people playing esport games. The baseball audience is 79 million, and I think that tells you all you need to know. And it's a whole lot longer and a whole lot slower. Yeah.
I'll say this. I have a 15-year-old son who was one of those 81 million who watches esports, and he will not watch a baseball game. If I turn on a baseball game, he leaves the room. It's like, oh, this is boring, too slow. So that's pretty telling.
Yeah. Well, Dave, as always, it's been great. So I wanted to thank our audience for joining us. I'm Tom Fox.
And I'm Dave Lefort. Thank you again, Tom, and I hope to see everybody in May.
This is Tom Fox again. Listeners to this podcast can get a $200 discount to Compliance Week 2022. I've linked to the registration site and the discount code FOX200 in the show notes. I've also listed to Jackie McMullen's new podcast, Icons, and some Compliance Week articles. The case study by Ali McDevitt on the ransomware attack. Hope you'll join Dave and I again next month where we take a look at some of the top articles in Compliance Week, talk some sports, and generally try to save the world. This is Tom Fox. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you are interested in how ESG intersects with compliance, check out my new podcast, The ESG Report, also appearing on the Compliance Podcast Network.